We are glad to be joined again today by Dr. Michael Carlisle, and I had a great conversation about his dissertation and where the Lord's brought him into that. And I thought today, or in this podcast, we'd be helped out by kind of illustrating what you've done. In fact, you did this as a part of your dissertation.
Yeah.
So why don't you just maybe even mention why you maybe chose 1 Peter as an illustration?
I don't really know why I chose 1 Peter as an illustration. There was lots of texts I could have chose. This one, to me, I just enjoy this particular passage. I think that had a lot to do with it, but it didn't matter. There's a different perspective, an ancient Mediterranean perspective of every text of the Bible that I could have used somehow to do this.
Right. Well, I thought that, dealing with the fact that the exile, the language right off the beginning connected to part of it.
Yeah. So I actually kind of enjoyed that. Again, I've been reading my Bible since, I was saved at 13 years old. And
Right.
after I got really interested in studying and understanding ancient Mediterranean people and their perspective, things about this passage, and this happens quite regularly, things about the passage just kind of like come at you with new relevance. And you start to see it's like, well, this, especially after being in Cambodia,
Yeah.
because we are an egalitarian society, the honor shame parts of 1 Peter, which are actually very core to the situation of the text,
Right.
don't really resonate with us. But after living in Cambodia for 13 years, they fly off at the page at me, and it's like, how do I preach this in a way that will reach modern American people
Absolutely.
who don't face these kinds of situations?
Yeah. In fact, in your you provide an appendix that looks at and starts doing some of the rhetorical analysis we mentioned in the first podcast.
Yeah.
And so kind of highlighting some of those things that step out of the text that perhaps in our hermeneutical approaches we haven't always looked at. So
Yeah. So in the previous podcast, we talked about how important it is to look at the rhetorical situation of the text from the ancient Mediterranean perspective rather than our own, because their values are different. Like I said a moment ago, if our values are egalitarian, we look at the situation of the text and don't see the full weight of the honor shame issues in here, whereas they saw that as being quite a bit the bigger issue.
right.
So the purpose of what the method is in chapter 6 is to force the exegete to face the situation of the text from that perspective. And Appendix A makes you work through things that would not be culturally normal for us as Americans. So that's what Appendix A is. It's forcing us to look at that rhetorical situation from a perspective other than our own.
Right.
So that when we get to the sermon in Appendix B, we're now seeing how we can relate that to a congregation that doesn't relate to that situation as well.
Right. So a couple of those, like you mentioned, some of the, the honor shame language that you see in the passage very clearly. If you understand honor shame society, they jump out. If you don't, you might miss it.
Yeah. So in this particular text, I chose 1 Peter 2, verses 4 to 10.
Right.
Some things that started flying off the page at me, I will say post Cambodia, was you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but chosen by God. Those two words, for us, it's kind of like, I chose this one thing and this one I rejected.
Right.
It's kind of flat. But in honor shame culture, to be chosen elevates your value over other people, and to be rejected does the exact opposite.
Right.
There's a vertical dimension to those two words alone, just those two words. And that's central to the rhetorical purpose of 1 Peter as a book. If you go back to chapter 1 and look at the opening verses,
Right.
he's saying the same thing about them. They are exiles. They have been rejected. They're foreigners. They're outsiders, but they're chosen by God. They become his children through the resurrection and the power of the word. And now they're connected to the highest being in the universe.
Yeah.
So there is a very vertical dimension to 1 Peter, and that flies off the page at me when I read just verse 4, the opening verse. But then he begins to explain that through the cultural or the metaphor of the temple and the priesthood. And I think historically for us as Americans, we've looked at the priesthood more in terms of functionality. We talk about the priesthood of believers. We think about what are the sacrifices, and it's interesting, Peter never mentions the sacrifices. He doesn't tell you what they are. And I think it's because it's not his point. His point is the people that are reading this or are listening to it have been rejected by their own families,
Right.
much like Cambodians are today. If they are not Buddhists, they are no longer Cambodian to their own people. They become outsiders to their own people. And in the ancient Mediterranean, if you did not worship your family's household gods, if you did not worship the local deities, you were actually a threat to society. And I think you see that coming out in chapter 4, the persecution. And Peter calls it a fiery trial in chapter 1. So there's this vertical dimension of them. They're outcasts in a society where being part of your family and your people is so important, so deeply important to their psyche.
Right.
And they're now rejected by the very people that clothed them with honor and love and acceptance. And they didn't, I say this in the sermon, they're not exiles because they physically moved to a new place. They became exiles at home,
Right.
in their own homes, in their own villages, because they trusted Christ and they rejected the vain ways, the futile ways of their ancestors. There's so much to unpack even in those words. But that's really the concern of the text here. And Peter is trying to say, you're being rejected by men, but here's how God is choosing you and what he's choosing you to be. And it's extremely honorable.
Right.
We don't think about the temple or the priesthood in terms of honor. We think of it more in terms of function and what happened there. But as we go through, we're forced to look at the situation and the words in the text from their perspective. The temple is a very honorable building.
Right.
It's like this stunning, huge structure plated with gold. And the priests, the people didn't just wear whatever color they wanted. Like you and I are wearing different colors today because we woke up and chose this out of the closet instead of that. Most people had just kind of brown clothes, like tan or brown clothes, but the priests wore white, and their clothes had more color and even gold threads, and they stood out. And you and I were talking about this downstairs before the podcast. When I read these post-Cambodia, it really stood out to me because the temples and the monks in Cambodia stand out amongst all the other houses that are made out of wood and all the other people because of the clothing. And there's really an honor-shame dimension there. People have great respect for that location and great respect for that monk. And that would have been an unavoidable impression for the people hearing these words because they had temples in their cities.
Right.
And every building looked the same until you saw this one massive structure. And we see them in ruins. It kind of, not play on words, it ruins our understanding, our perspective of what this building meant to the people that first saw it. But that would have been like a shocking illustration for them. You're being rejected for not following your ancestral deities and the local deities. And here God is making you the most fantastic, visually spectacular, and honorable building in the whole city, and powerful, because this is where you have access to God.
And it really does. I mean, so when you're dealing with people that are experiencing the magnitude of rejection, because be rejected from your family structure, rejected in your social structure, I mean, they were truly experiencing being an outcast.
Yes.
And in that way, almost the lowest tier they could even be thought of by their family. But then they're contrasting that to what God has done and who you now are and what God has done in elevating you, really, in an elevation that is unimaginable.
So what I really like about what you just said is the word magnitude, because I think that an American could get the basic idea. Okay, yeah, so they're rejected and they're chosen.
Right.
But what's key is the magnitude of that for the person, the magnitude of the rejection, which Americans don't face. We have freedom of religion. It doesn't matter. My neighbor's a Mormon. The next house down, they're atheists, and we're all Americans, and we all get one vote, and we all have the same social power, essentially. But for them, the magnitude, the depth of the rejection and what that meant to them is entirely different because their cultural circumstances were different. And the flip side of the coin of what you just said is the magnitude of the honor.
Right.
And we're not an honor shame culture. That's not really important to us. So we kind of blow over it and we say, well, this has to be about function because function is more important to us than honor shame.
Right.
And we start talking about what priests do, and that's not what Peter's talking about. I mean, think about how he concludes the passage here. I like to draw this out in verse 9. You are a chosen race. Okay, he's talking about bodies of people, race, priesthood, nation, a people for God's own possession. But each of the modifiers he puts with that is honorific. You are
Right.
chosen race. You're a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. And that, I think what you just said is like, it's the magnitude of what God has done that we miss because our culture doesn't see honor, shame as important.
Right. And he's elevated you to a status that is above every status you could even think you have on earth. And now you're joined with a people, because it is a people.
The highest status on earth, save God.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so putting in that, which is again even meant to put his readers' suffering in a perspective. So they are suffering as a people, but they're elevated by God.
Yeah. And he's giving them hope later on in the book that when Christ returns, they're going to actually, now they're experiencing shame.
Right.
And they know about God's honor, God's privileging them, the magnitude of God's honoring them. But when Christ returns, they're going to share in his glory. And so there's the actual concrete hope of one day when he comes back, that's going to be experienced.
And I think one of the other things that we talked about too is in terms of that priesthood and being born again at the start of the book is we're actually dealing with that lineage and even bloodlines.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another interesting, a very interesting point, because that's not really, we don't really care about preserving bloodlines anymore. It's not something really important to our culture. And there are some people, a few people that are concerned about that. But for the most part, preserving your last name, preserving your bloodline, it's not a complete disaster if you're a man like me that had only daughters and you don't have a man to carry on your name or a son to carry on your name. But in their culture, that was paramount for a lot of very important reasons. And I won't get into those for the sake of time, but he's saying that you're a priesthood. How did you become a priest? I just happened to, go to seminary and was a gifted preacher and they made me the priest. That's not how it worked. No. That's how you become a pastor today. But the priest, whether he was good at preaching or not, was a priest because he was born into that bloodline. He was born into the line of Levi and Aaron. And that's what gave him the right to do that. And it was a birth status. And Peter's talking about birth in chapter 1.
Right.
He's talking about you've been born again, in part through the resurrection, in part through the imperishable seed of the word. And that makes you a child of God. Yeah. And being a child of God, in this case, makes you a priest, which is why it's so important that you're a royal priesthood. These are bloodline words,
right?
Like you said. So it's like,
you become part of the most important family ever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is part of the Cambodian connection for me, the importance of family. Family is important to us as Americans, so I'm not trying to deny that, but our perspective on family is very limited because we have nuclear families.
Right.
A household usually is mom and dad and kids.
Right.
Whereas in many places around the world today still, and in the ancient Mediterranean, family we all lived in the same village. Most of us are related by blood because there's like maybe 4 or 5 family names within 200 people and we're all related by marriage somehow.
Yeah.
Everybody's family, and family is everything. You hear people say this, family is everything to me.
Right.
And now that family is rejecting you.
Yep.
How much more important is it to be born into the family of God?
And then have a church that is now your family.
Yes. We have one God, we have one Father who is God, and we are all brothers and sisters together. Yeah. It's a situation that most Americans, I think we can understand some things about it, but we don't really relate to it. And I think to understand Peter's message as a preacher, I want to help people relate to it better. So they're like feeling the rejection at the beginning of the sermon that Peter's audience was facing, and then they're experiencing the elevation that God is giving to them, and like you said earlier, the magnitude of those two things.
And even bringing that to that connecting point too, to all of this connects you to Christ, who was also rejected but chosen of God and a cornerstone.
Yeah.
So you're connecting these dots that what you've experienced, Jesus experienced.
First. He did this first for you.
Yeah.
By dying on the cross and experiencing all of the shame of the cross, which is really the focus of the Gospels.
Right.
I've heard American preachers wax eloquent about the pain
Right.
of the cross. You know what words don't occur in the Gospels? Pain, anguish. But what's constantly being shown through the Gospels? The shame, the mocking,
Right.
all of those things. Even like the crown of thorns
Right.
and the reed staff, all that is all, the shame of it. But yeah, it's trying to draw people into seeing that situation in the text from their perspective, because that again goes back to authorial intent. That's what he wanted them to see.
Absolutely.
And just because those things don't resonate in our culture doesn't get us off the hook. If we're really committed to authorial intent, we want to bring our congregation to see the text the way the author did, so that when he gets to what he wants his first audience to do, we can relate that to our situation, even if it's different. And that's a whole nother bridge to cross.
Yep. Well, it's been fantastic, Michael. I so appreciate your time. And this study, I think, is going to bear a lot of fruit for us to think through and to be more careful exegetes with the scripture and to be able to communicate the grand, what's there in the text is amazing to see, but we need the eyes to see it. And this study
Yeah.
is going to help us see it.
Well, thank you. And thanks again for the opportunity. And I wanted to say at some point, I'm just really grateful to Bob Jones University for accepting me as a doctoral candidate and helping me work through this. All the people that read my dissertation, starting with Dr. Stykes and Dr. Talbert and Dr. Hand, who read the first few chapters, and then you as well, coming in at the end. It was all just, this was coming from a person that's lived in Cambodia for 13 years, this might mean a little bit more, but this was a community project in many ways. And it was very special to me to have all of you involved, and the feedback was really helpful. So thank you.